Hi, I'm Cate Blanchett, and I'm here in Davos in my capacity as a Goodwill Ambassador for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And the theme here at Davos is Fractured World, Shared Solutions. And for me, there's no one who embodies more powerfully the notion of the fractured world than the refugee. But what I think we'd like to explore today is how art and storytelling and creative endeavours, creative expressions help us sort of reframe the refugee experience. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of xenophobia, a lot of labels being bandied around about refugees. And I think if we build a culture of encounter, then perhaps we can heal some of those divides and help sort of change those misconceptions. But before we start, I'd like to just run a few numbers by you. Every minute, every single minute of every day at the moment, 20 people, every minute 20 people are forced to flee their homes. And right now, around the world, there's over 65 million people who are forcibly displaced. And over 22 million of those are refugees, which means that they've been forced to cross an international border, in your case, several international borders, and seek sanctuary in countries other than their homeland. And half of that 22 million refugees are under the age of 18, which as a mother I find really, really distressing. And half of that 22 million are women and girls. And just a couple more numbers before we start, but I think really important numbers, is that only 1% of that 22 million, 1% of those refugees are resettled into places like the UK, the US, Australia and Europe. And in fact, 84% of refugees are actually hosted in the developing world, in countries that are struggling to meet the needs and provide services for their own people. And often I think the discourse around refugees is that they're coming into the developing world and being hosted. And in fact, that's really not the case. And so I think these numbers are really important for today's, as a context for today's discussion. But also I think they show the devastating scale and scope of the refugee crisis, and underpins the work that the UNHCR does, because they're mandated to lead and the support and protection of the world's most vulnerable, or the refugees who are forced to flee their homes. And I've certainly learnt in my role as a Goodwill Ambassador and my experience with UNHCR in the field that, in fact, perhaps the most important number is the number one. And it underpins all of the work that the UNHCR staff does in the field, is that we talk about the numbers and they're overwhelming, but in fact they deal with people individually. And it's the importance of the individual story, because every refugee experience is different, it's unique. And I think that the numbers can allow us to disconnect and perhaps allow our governments off the hook in a way, and us as in the private sector and in our everyday lives, to forget that there's people and faces and experiences and creative drives and hopes and aspirations, of those individual people. And I suppose today too we're going to focus on the individual story and bring back the power of that individual story to allow us to sort of reconnect and re-engage, because I think if we want to build a more compassionate and welcoming and open-hearted, less xenophobic environment where refugees are appreciated and welcomed and seen and given the aid they really need, I think the public needs to be able to connect. Our governments need to remember the stories, the individual human stories behind those figures. So, two people who understand very well the power of individual storytelling are here, JJ Bowler and Aya Abdu. Welcome. I'm really, really thrilled that you could make the journey through the snow today to join me. And JJ, talking about labels, you're a former refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you were brought up from the age of 7 in London. A couple more labels. You're a poet and you're a writer. And Aya's a refugee from Iraq, and you're currently living here in Switzerland, and you've advocated on a number of issues surrounding the refugee experience, particularly those affecting youth. So before we actually get talking, I'm going to stop in a minute. I just wanted to say that there's been lots of questions flowing in over the last several days and this morning, and we're going to try and get to those at the end. So if you have any questions for Aya or for JJ about the power of storytelling and the power of the one voice, then do keep flowing them in and we'll try and get to them. But we've got lots to talk about. So, JJ, You came to England when you were 7 with your family, and that's a very young age. I mean, language is a very powerful thing, but did you know that you were a refugee? What was the experience like? Did you even know what a refugee was at that age?
No, didn't know. We had no idea about the political circumstance that we'd fled from. Our parents really tried their best to protect us from the reality of being a refugee. And so at the time, me and my siblings and my mum and dad, we came to London fleeing the dictatorship of President Mobutu that lasted 32 years. And those of us who are aware of Congolese politics, we know that it was very brutal. You know? And what was one of the most kind of revelatory things was, as I grew older, transitioned into my teenage years, starting to learn more about my own history and my own kind of like circumstance and how my own particular experience differentiated from those of my peers and my schoolmates and so forth. And initially I felt kind of a bit of a shame towards it, because it's something that you try and hide. It's not something that you're necessarily proud of. There's a lot of negative stigma around being a refugee. You know, a lot of, you get negatively treated and so forth, but eventually I began to find empowerment through that and use my voice in terms of educating people and informing them on issues that they're not aware about. So it's a kind of like a double-edged sword in many ways.
Because there's a lot of grief and trauma, obviously, the things that you've seen and the atmosphere that you fled from, you know, being forcibly displaced, and to not be able to tell that story for a long time. I mean, you've channeled it into to your work. Which is, I suppose, has been a healing thing, and it's also a way of getting those stories I mean, I've seen your work, on YouTube, and it's really, really incredibly powerful. I mean, Aya, you've been a double refugee. I mean, it's a beggar's belief. I mean, first from Iraq to Syria, and then from Syria to Switzerland via Turkey. And so could you tell us a little bit about your story and how perhaps the notion of being a refugee was different in each of those different places? That's a long journey.
Well, actually, I was a child, so one night my father came and told me, "Get your bag, we are going." And I didn't understand where are we going to. I thought that
How
we
old
are going.
were you?
I was 13, and I thought that he's taking me to trip because he didn't describe that we are leaving the country. And I fled Iraq in 2009. We went to Syria, and then the war came again and chose me again to be a refugee. And in 2011, I went to Turkey. So, I mean, I fled twice, and I feel that I'm a double refugee, that making everything more hard, actually, because I'm living this experience twice, and I'm living the same issues, but when I went from Syria to Turkey, I was thinking, and I know that I'm a refugee and I'm going to go to another country. So actually, it's very difficult. I can't say being refugee is easy, but we don't choose to be refugees. The destiny is just choosing us. So, and after that, from Turkey to Switzerland, it was a really long journey. I learned a lot. I was working as a refugee for refugees, and that made me more strong, because I feel that we need to show our community as like we are not the victims, and I need to do that.
So you felt you were encountering labels that were not true to actually who you were, that people were encountering the label of refugee, the notion of, you know, that you're after jobs, you're after their homes, and in fact you were sort of hands held out.
Actually, yes, because, I mean, okay, we fled our countries, we left our countries, we lost a lot of things. We lost our friends, relatives, schools, homes, but we didn't lose our brain, and we could build a life again. So that made me feel more strong and go and help my people.
It was funny talking about misconceptions too, and I heard you speaking before about you were putting makeup on, and someone was incredibly surprised that you...
Actually, that was very funny, because I mean, in each different country that I went, In Syria, in the beginning, it was very easy because of the language, and we are so near. And then Turkey, it was kind of culture shock, let me say, because of the language. But the biggest thing that I lived here in Switzerland, I went to the French class, and one of the Swiss girls asked me that, Aya, you are putting makeup in an amazing way. Oh my God, do you have makeup in your country? And I was like, what? Really? You're asking this? We are normal human beings. I mean, we are interested with makeup. I have a pet. I have a dog, and he's so lovely. And I was reunited with him last weekend. So, yeah, I mean, we are normal human beings.
I remember when I first went to America, I was visiting some relatives, and they asked me if I had chocolate biscuits in my country, from Australia. It's sort of funny, because I think that, there's a lot of people who don't travel, and so the Middle East or the Democratic Republic of Congo may as well be the moon for them. So hearing your stories is so important to sort of get a sense of the culture that you came from, and what you can offer your host country, culturally and socially. And you've just been accepted into university, which is
my God, that
incredible.
It was
Congratulations.
amazing. Thanks for Webster to give me this opportunity. I mean, they made my life, actually. So I want to thank them so much.
It's wonderful. It's
a
whole new chapter's beginning. Because I think, in my experience, and the refugees that I've met on my travel, they wouldn't identify at all as being refugees. And if they're asked to sort of give a few words to describe themselves, it would be sports fan, architect, mother, son, daughter, wife, comedian, fashion designer. And it's just, I think there's a real power around the language that we use to describe people, and those labels can be a very big obstacle into making connections in host countries. And you understand the power of language, absolutely. And do you think it's a barrier to people connecting with?
It can be a barrier. I've definitely experienced it myself, and I myself were talking earlier, when someone hears or sees the label refugee being applied to, all of a sudden there's a victimization. They feel sorry for you, and they almost want to instantly apologize, when in fact, there has been a lot of trauma that we as a community have been through, but we choose to empower ourselves. We don't look at necessarily the negative of our situations, but we look at what we've overcome, and we look at the skills that we've gained from it. If I look at the resilience that my parents have taught me, my dad speaks 6 languages, my mum speaks about 4, and to have the skill to be able to move to a new place, a complete new place, and learn and adapt into society, but also raise children who contribute into that society. And I look at the work that I'm doing in terms of my education work or the creative writing, and the number of people that I've been privileged to impact. And that's such a significant contribution that I don't know if I would have been able to make if I did not have that experience. And I think it's about empowering people to look beyond the labels, because no matter whether it's a refugee or whatever label it is, negative labels don't define us, and they don't have to define us. We are so much more than whatever we've been stigmatized as. And people really learn that there's connections, both ways, not just in terms of what a refugee can contribute, but also what the person can learn and contribute back. It's a symbiotic process. Yeah, definitely.
And you've obviously, through your poetry, what if you, I've seen you do some on the Millennium Bridge, and there were people who kind of gathered around you, and what's the experience, the reaction that you've had when you've told your story and your experience and the atmospheres and the obstacles that you've overcome and the things you've seen in poetry?
It's been completely overwhelming for me, I have to say. And I didn't really understand the power of storytelling until I started writing poetry myself. Prior to that, I did a lot of campaign work with different organisations. I was part of a young refugee network called Voices of Young Refugees in Europe. And we did a lot of workshops and campaign and education work towards both ordinary people, but also politicians. And there was a certain level of engagement. But when it came to poetry, it was as if like a light had been shone on people, and there was an instant connection. I had people who came up to me, who would come up to me and say that your poems made me cry, or that they didn't know that was what they were experiencing, or even some people have said, we didn't know, they weren't aware about the lives that we were leaving behind, because so often a refugee is seen as someone who's just immediately poor, uneducated, and they have no opportunities, when in fact we are leaving a significant part of our lives behind. It's a very difficult decision to make, and a decision that, like your father had to make at that moment, whether or not you have to leave. And sometimes, it's for the best, and sometimes it's not. But
and also sometimes that happens incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
And last year, with the help of Facebook, a group of us put together, Jennifer Toxvig, who's a poet in the UK, did this incredibly powerful rhythmic poem that was based on first-person testimony called What They Took With Them, a list. And it was a list of everything or things that people took with them, because they often have to flee within 45 seconds. The house is being bombed, and whether they take their passport or their house keys to a house that they may never be able to return to. Their mobile phone. I've encountered, back in my home country of Australia, saying, well, if refugees can afford to have a mobile phone, surely they don't need our help. But you think a mobile phone is actually, it's actually now a receptacle for photographs, which are memories. They're also the only way of getting in contact with people that you don't know, family members, whether they're living or not. But anyway, this poem, it was very powerful. Just the continual repetition of what people took with them. For me, it really struck home. Just the kind of there, but for the grace of God moment. It could have been me, and also made me reflect what I would take with me. And we put a hashtag on it, a hashtag with refugees, to try and drive sign-up petitions in advance of the global meeting last year, obviously in New York, to try and re-engage leaders, but also the public, to remind people that refugees have the right to shelter, the right to work, the right to, and refugee children have a right to an education, which you so powerfully embody. And you've been a strong advocate, Aya, for all of those issues. But often refugees are left out of the solution conversation. So it's really, I think, really wonderful that you're been appointed to sit on the UNHCR new Global Youth Advisory Council. So I suppose if you could talk a little bit about how important it is to have your voice heard, the refugee voice heard in the solution conversation, but also how you tell your story in that context, how it might help.
Well, actually, this was amazing, because we refugees are facing challenges every single day, and we were thinking, why is not this happening as a solution? So we already made our solution by ourselves, but we didn't have the power to go and do it. Mm-hmm. So being a member of the Global Youth Advisory Council actually is very important, because I'm, as a refugee, a voice for the voiceless refugee, because I know I'm a lucky one. I'm the resettled lucky one. So I need to represent the people or the youth behind me, because I know we are millions, and I'm the one who has the responsibility, who have the responsibility now to go and to speak about the problems and how we can make it better. Because I was meeting with hundreds of refugees when I was in Turkey day by day. And then I discovered that, okay, I know the issues, and I'm taking the solutions from refugees by themselves, mm-hmm. and I'm putting my voice inside of it and in giving it. So that would be very easy, because we know our community and we know what should happen to make everything easier. So yeah, that was a big opportunity for me, and it's a big responsibility in the same time, because I need to think about the different group of refugees, because I'm representing all, trying to.
Mm. That reminds me, a question that did come in was about, and this was from out there, was that what is the best way, according to you, to help a refugee? You said you've been talking to I imagine a lot of women and girls as well, who are in particular peril when they're forced to flee. And what was the common thread to those stories that you heard? What, from the refugee experience, how can we help?
Actually, I'm just asking the whole world to support us and believe in us and give us kind of leadership, so we can go together and make the world a more, let me say, safe place and welcoming us, because no one is choosing to be refugee, and anyone could be in our situation in any time. Never know. So believe in us, support us, and please think before describing us in any words. We are not just victims. We can change. We could be leaders for our community. We have a lot of amazing youth who could lead. So I really hope that to be
Because certainly in the Syrian situation, when I was in Lebanon, I was in a community centre with a group of people who'd been appointed by their own communities to come and try and work and strategise a way to help to go back into their communities, like you're describing, to give help to people like themselves. And I went round and asked each of them what they did. And it was architect, it was lawyer, it was doctor, it was plumber, it was engineer, it was mother of five, a social worker. And there's a sense that that somehow people arrive with no skill base, no perspective, and nothing to offer culturally. And I think that that's when that language becomes incredibly powerful.
I just want to add as well, like the number one factor for essentially a person living there for full life is social integration. So not just for refugees, but just people generally. So I think if people are not quite sure about how to help, you try and see how you can socially integrate refugees in your community, whether it's just sitting down and having a conversation or, just hanging out, doing similar activities in a way that helps socially integrate the refugees in the community. That will have long-lasting effects and really help to contribute to communities for generations to come.
And I think it's the volunteering. There's so many refugees arrive with dormant skills that have not been used because they may have only just arrived in a host country's shore, but they've been internally displaced or crossed many borders, and they haven't been able to work for a long time. And as we all know, that gives it such a great sense of purpose. So I'm just curious, when you said you found this group that you to finally find a channel and an outlet to tell your story, how did you come across that? Was it someone in your host community that pointed you in that direction, or was it UNHCR?
Chance, really, I think. And I think, I started writing poetry and then put it on a blog, and then it started receiving a bit of attention, and I think it was from that I was able to develop a network of people. So, and we've been saying this, that online, like the internet and social media has had such a significant impact on changing the narrative, and I think that's what's been really influential for me as well.
And so do you find that you're able to reach out further? I mean, obviously it's the face-to-face, it's the encountering and...
Yeah, it's like you're able to reach out further, you're able to essentially transform people's ideas about a stereotype or a stigma. But when people meet you face to face and they see that it is genuine, that the experiences that you're talking about is your lived experiences, and that you're not confabulating a story just for attention or anything like that, but this is something that you actually personally feel attached to because it's your story, it's your family stories, it's your community stories, and you want to change those experiences so that it doesn't have to be repeated generation after generation. In this day and age, there's no reason why there should still have to be refugees in the world, and if there are refugees who are treated negatively in the way that they are. So we as human beings, when we understand how we are connected, we can really transform people's lived experiences.
And I mean, another really important word, I think, is the notion of the word home. And I wonder, there's a lot of refugees that I met in Jordan and Lebanon, and when they spoke of home, it was the smells, and it was the food, it was the baklava, it was the street that they lived on, which is now just a bunch of rubble, the place they can't return to. When you hear that word home, what do you think of? Did you find a home in Turkey for a short time? Is it now Switzerland? What do you think of when you think of that word?
Well, actually, my main home is Iraq, even if I lived there just for 7 years of my life. But whenever I hear Iraq, I don't know what's happening to me, something emotional. I just get like I want to cry because I feel that I'm related to that country and I want to go. And when I will be on that ground, I will be the peaceful person ever. But I can say that each country that I lived in, I can describe it as a home also, because I lived in it in a safe way. So this is enough to me. Home is safety.
And what about you?
And for me, I mean, through my writing, I've really explored this. I've recently published a novel called No Place to Call Home, and I'm constantly questioning.
Just that you have that little plug.
And so it almost answers your question. I think is the book. No, I think home for me really is a feeling. It's an idea. It's a place wherever you find yourself, and there's parts of me because we're all complex beings. There's parts of me that's deeply at home in Congo, but there's also parts of me that's deeply at home in London and in places that I've visited for the first time that feel so familiar to me. You know, and I think as home is wherever you see a reflection of yourself, and hopefully if we're reflected in different places that we go, we won't ever feel alien to anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, because I have children, I think about the notion of home a lot, about being a place of safety and sanctuary, and I think that's a big issue for refugees. Is it's knowing that they have, not only are being housed and having their basic needs met by, that often happens by UNHCR's incredible work, but it's also knowing that they're safe, that they can finally breathe, take a deep breath. So I think we've got time for a few questions, maybe one more. JJ, this is a question, how could we raise awareness about those forgotten crises?
That's a really good question. So in my case, particularly in terms of DRC, the politics of Congo is really not spoken about in the mainstream. We've got the war that's been happening in the eastern side of Congo for 20 years and the current political situation where the president has kind of overstayed his mandate, and there's a lot of issues around elections. And I think for me, the best way to raise awareness is to share information. So there's an amazing documentary called Crisis in Congo that has a lot of information in terms of what's going on back home, but also have conversations with people beyond just the regurgitation of what's in the mainstream, and try to also learn as much as you can. It can be really difficult in this day and age when we've got so much attention to information to filter through, but try and share and learn and be as educated and empowered as you can be, and share information through various creative means, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, etc. I know that art can transform the way people think, and it's definitely transformed the way I think.
Well, speaking of art, I think we probably have to stop there. But thanks, Facebook, for hosting us, and UNHCR for the incredible work you do in supporting and protecting the rights and the livelihoods of refugees. And for all of you watching, thank you. And I think we've been talking about storytelling and the power of one voice, one story. So I think there's no better way to sort of celebrate that than to go out with JJ and your poem.
Okay, this poem is called Refuge. Imagine how it feels to be chased out of home, to have your grip ripped, loosened from your fingertips, something you so dearly held onto. Like a lover's hand that slips when it is pulled away, you are always reaching. My father would speak of home, reaching. Speaking of familiar faces, the girl next door who would eventually grow up to be my mother, the fruit seller at the market, the lonely man at the top of the road who nobody spoke to, and our house at the bottom of the street, lit up by a single flickering lamp where beyond was only darkness. There, they would sit and tell stories of monsters that lurked and came only at night, to catch the children who sat and listened to stories of monsters that lurked. This is how they lived. Each memory buried, an artifact left to be discovered by archaeologists, the last words on a dying family member's lips. This was sacred. Not even monsters could taint it. But there were monsters that came during the day. Monsters who tore families apart with their giant hands and fingers that slept on triggers. The sound of gunshots ripping through the sky became familiar like the tapping of rainfall on the windowsill. Monsters that would kill and hide behind speeches, suits and ties. Monsters that would chase families away, forcing them to leave everything behind. I remember when we first stepped off the plane. Everything was foreign, unfamiliar, uninviting. Even the air in my lungs left me short of breath. We came here to find refuge. They called us refugees, so we hid ourselves in their language until we sounded just like them, changed the way we dressed to look just like them, made this our home until we lived just like them and began to speak of familiar faces, the girl next door who'd eventually grow up to be a mother, the fruit seller at the market, the lonely man at the top of the road who nobody spoke to, and our house at the bottom of the street, lit up by a single flickering lamp where beyond was only darkness. There, we would sit and watch police that lurked and came only at night, to arrest the youths who sat and watched police that lurked. This is how we lived. I remember one day I heard them say to me, they come here to take our jobs. They need to go back to where they came from. Not knowing that I was one of the ones who came, I told them that a refugee is simply someone who is trying to make a home. So next time, when you go home, tuck your children in and kiss your families good night. Be glad that the monsters never came for you. in their suits and ties, never came for you in the newspapers where the media lies, never came for you, that you are not despised. And know that deep inside the hearts of each and every one of us, we are all always reaching for a place that we can call home.